A listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you, and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, the drug overdose crisis that's killing a plane load of Australians every month. We delve into the confronting new report that reveals the common everyday medications behind these accidental and preventable deaths. But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Thursday, the 10th of July. At least one person has been killed and two others critically injured, including a child, after a car ploughed through a local playground in Melbourne's east this afternoon. Police say a 91-year-old woman was driving the vehicle at the time when she reportedly lost control. Here's Superintendent Justin Goldsmith from Victoria Police.
It's an absolute tragedy, and unfortunately we're facing a horrific month for road trauma. We've had 14 people lose their lives in 7 days. The fact that we've lost so many lives and had so many life-threatening injuries over the course of the last week is completely horrific and unacceptable.
Universities are firmly in the sights of the federal government as its special envoy on antisemitism hands down a widespread plan to combat the increase of antisemitism across Australia. The special envoy, Gillian Siegel, recommended stripping funding from broadcasters, universities and art institutions where possible who fail in fighting antisemitism. Among the report's key recommendations, screening visa applicants for anti-Semitic views and creating a national database to record hate crimes. Here is the Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese.
In a democracy, you should be able to express your view here in Australia about events overseas. Where the line has been crossed is in blaming and identifying people because they happen to be Jewish if you have a view about the directions of the Netanyahu government or any other government for that matter.
The report states anti-Semitism has increased in Australia since the October 7 Hamas terror attack on Israel and Israel's invasion of Gaza. The opposition has welcomed the plan but wants clarity on which recommendations the federal government plans to adopt. And an incredible survival story as a teenage surfer is found alive on a remote island after he went missing at sea overnight. The 19-year-old's family was fearing the worst when he disappeared after going for a surf on the New South Wales North Coast yesterday afternoon. Darcy Defholtz was swept out to sea. Rescuers finding him on a remote island this morning, some 12 kilometres from where he disappeared. His father says he can't fathom how Darcy survived, saying it's a 1 in a million miracle. Darcy is now recovering in hospital. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on the overdose crisis killing hundreds of Australians every month, the equivalent of a Boeing 737. Public health and safety expert John Wright explains how a revealing new report has exposed why so many Australians don't understand the dangers of many common medications that can lead to sudden death and preventable overdoses. John, thanks so much for joining us. These stats are pretty confronting when it comes to how many Australians are dying from drug overdoses.
Well, yeah, I actually think they are incredibly confronting. We've done an analysis for the last 10 years and every year it's exceeded the road toll. And this recent report shows that the overdose toll is about double the road toll. So it's a huge number of Australians dying. 80% of the overdose toll is actually unintentional. So they're accidental overdoses. And it's the equivalent of about every month losing a Boeing 737. And the reason I say that is because that would really capture our attention if it was a plane crash. But these deaths are happening, in the quiet of suburban houses and in the quiet of regional rural towns. They're mostly happening in private, so they don't really confront us the way that other tragedies happen and capture our imagination in that way. But I do think the numbers are extraordinarily high. And, the people that are dying are often in the prime of their life. Most in fact, all age categories are covered in the overdose toll. So people from 0 to, very elderly, but the majority are in their 30s, their 40s and their 50s. So it's people who've often got parents that are still alive and even have children that survive them. And so the impact is not just that huge number of people that pass, but it's all of the family and friends and work colleagues that are left behind.
Yeah, you make a great point, John. In regards to, you mentioned more than 3/4 of these deaths were unintentional. So how does that happen? Is that these people are unintentionally mixing prescription drugs and alcohol? How is this unintentional?
Yeah, so it doesn't mean that they didn't intend to consume something, but they certainly didn't intend to die as a consequence. And so, the stories are many, but a typical one will be someone that, for example, they had a workplace injury or a sporting injury or in fact a traffic related trauma, a car accident or something. They end up on painkillers because they've got some sort of long-term trauma. So they're on high-dose opioids. They have anxiety-related issues or they can't sleep. So they're prescribed anti-anxiety medications or sleeping tablets. And then, they have a few beers or some wines or spirits or something on top of that, and there's an accidental overdose. The problem with the overdose toll is that it's never simple and it's often a combination of drugs and they can be all pharmaceutical drugs or some pharmaceutical drugs plus illegal drugs. I mean, heroin and amphetamines are still contributing to the overdose toll, so is cocaine, but the pharmaceuticals and even alcohol are all implicated. So it's interesting in a sense that the stories are so diverse. I've been really looking at overdose for years now, and sometimes it's people dying from ignorance. I don't know how many times I've met family members who thought that their family, that their son or their daughter or their partner was so-called sleeping it off. One of the signs of an opioid overdose is unusual snoring or sort of gurgling sounds. And people often think, oh, well, they're just sleeping it off and so they leave them there. And I've spoken to absolutely devastated parents who left their kid, their 22-year-old kid or whatever, on the couch thinking that they were just sleeping it off, but actually they were slowly overdosing. And the end result of that is that those parents are absolutely grief-stricken, but that person died basically from the ignorance of those around them, which is why, to my mind, one of the big challenges is actually improving community understanding about this, because we're always going to have some level of drug harm, but we don't need to have this high level of drug harm.
You make a great point there, John, because you mentioned earlier about really putting this into perspective, that drug overdoses, and especially opioids, are killing the equivalent of a Boeing 737 full of Australians every month, much higher than our road toll. They're just not statistics. These are people, and you mentioned before, they have friends and they have families. It rips families and it rips local communities apart.
It absolutely does. And I think part of the problem is that we have a shroud of secrecy over these issues. Unfortunately, I'm aware of a number of families who have preferred to say that their intimate that has passed died as a result of suicide rather than saying it was overdose. So people think that an accidental overdose is more dirty or something than a suicide. Like the level of desperation and pain and suffering in those families, the grief is extraordinary. And to add to it is some of the judgment that other members of the community apply. We've got this idea that people that overdose brought it on themselves or they're criminals or something or other, but it's so not true. It's actually really mainstream Australia. It covers right across the geographic spread. So people from regional and rural Australia as well as the big cities, that's for sure. But interestingly also, it's people from the poorest backgrounds, people from the middle, and people from right at the top. And, I've been way too familiar with too many people from all of those stratas of society where no one is willing to actually talk about these issues at the funeral, within the social network, within the announcement of the death. It's a real catastrophe in terms of being open and honest and actually helping people heal from the grief and their loss. We've got to be honest about these things, I think, and that's part of the reason why we do the overdose report. It's an opportunity to be honest about what's going on in the community and not to hide it.
You make a great point again, John. It's about honesty, it's about being transparent, but also supporting the many people that pass away, unfortunately, accidentally, and then all of their family and friends who continue to suffer in silence. Obviously, we need better education, but all of us have seen the documentaries about Big Pharma, about the addiction of painkillers, and that in some circumstances, scripts are being written out like no tomorrow for painkillers and that they're highly addictive. What do you think needs to happen to turn these overdoses around?
Well, I think that's true. And I think luckily there's less of the irresponsible prescribing and dispensing of medicines than there was 5 years ago, but there's still too much. And so people are still becoming dependent. And, those anti-anxiety drugs, benzodiazepine class, they are extremely dependency creating. And so people are on them, the shortest period to be on them is the best period. But some people need them for ongoing healthcare. For those people, it's really important that they be fully aware of the risks of those drugs and actually continuously be open and honest with their doctor, because you can't stop those drugs overnight. You've got to actually be really careful with them. So that, we've got to get out of this mentality that just because they're pharmaceuticals, they're safe. Just because they're pills, they're safe. There's a lot of illicit market drugs now that are created, manufactured to look exactly like legitimate pharmaceutical drugs. So not only do we have the old sort of powder form or crystal form of illegal drugs, but there are now illegal drugs that are basically identical to the naked eye to what you would get from the pharmacy. So the drug market is becoming increasingly dangerous, in my view, increasingly potent drugs, increasingly diverse drugs, and, often much more dangerous in relation to overdose, in which case we've got to have a much more educated community about pharmaceutical drugs and illegal drugs, because in a way, one of the big risk reduction approaches is for individuals and families to actually know the issues back to front and to know how to deal with them. That's a good first step. But the other one, I think, is making sure for the opioid class, whether it's heroin or endone or oxycodone or fentanyl or whatever opioid substance, they're all reversible with naloxone. It's a miracle. It's only a miracle for opioid overdose, but it is a miracle drug, naloxone or Narcan. And it's available in Australia. It's available over the counter at some pharmacies, a lot of pharmacies, and some healthcare services like needle and syringe programs and some drug treatment services, but it's not nearly well enough understood in the community. First responders often don't actually carry it, let alone first aid, people that are responsible for first aid in their organisation, let alone family members who know they've got someone who's at risk of overdose. All of those different groups, we should be really flooding the market with naloxone or Narcan, because in an emergency, if you don't have it, it's useless. If you do have it and you know how to use it, you're going to save a life. So increased access to naloxone, I think, requires national leadership. It's very doable. It's a drug that doesn't have any abuse potential. You can't get high on it. It doesn't do you any damage. We should have it everywhere. It's a really important conversation, and thank you so much for bringing it to our attention and chatting with us today. Thanks, John. Thank you. Great to talk. That was public health and safety expert John Ryan, the CEO of the Pennington Institute. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast. And we'll be back in your feed tomorrow at 6 a.m. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.